Cool. We'll do a little review, and then we'll take our quizzes again. This one's not as weird because it's not a bunch of dates. I don't want to torture you guys with dates again. So I don't even like the dates thing. It takes me a long time to memorize the dates. Numbers are not. I'm not as bad as James, but numbers are not good. So I want to go over real quick the early ecumenical councils. We talked about this last week. I wanted to clarify a couple things. One is we talked a little bit about, I just briefly mentioned in the book, like mentioned it for 2 seconds, and that is, well, actually I talked about it again in this chapter, and that's Monophysitism. So Monophysitism is this idea that, well, you guys, anybody, who wants to tell me what that is? How about that? Oh, golly, yeah. It's right there. There's the answer, right there, yeah. So this is this idea that there isn't the two natures of Christ in one. It's that he sort of was like, God was so big that he kind of washed away the human part of Jesus, right? So the analogy is that if you drop a drop of wine in the ocean, this was the analogy they would use in the old days, in the ancient days. If you dropped a drop of wine into the ocean, it would immediately dissipate. You wouldn't even know that wine was there anymore. So this was condemned in Chalcedon, which is the Fourth Ecumenical Council. There are faith traditions now still today, Egyptian Coptic, Ethiopian Coptic, Syrian Coptic churches that are what are still considered monophysite. They only agree with the first 3 ecumenical councils. Now what's funny is if you actually ask somebody, like at Denver Seminary we have a lot of Ethiopians there, if you actually ask them, are you monophysite, they'd be like, no. Like we've kind of gone past that, but it was still a contention. It's sort of like the same reason we talked about last week about the filioque, how the Orthodox are like, well, technically it's not really a theological problem, we just have beef about it still. So once again, it's not a theological distinctiveness so much anymore. I'm sure if you ask somebody's still in monophysite, but that was what led initially to the Egyptian Copts, Ethiopian Copts, and so on. So they only believe in the first 3 councils. Now let's fast forward to the Protestant Reformation. The Anglican Church, or the Church of England, or in America, the Episcopal Church, and I don't want to get into all that, but anyways, basically the Anglican Communion, they only adopt the first 4 ecumenical councils. And why is that? Well, because those are really, and we talked about this, I mentioned at least, is that that's the meat and potatoes. After that, 5, 6, and 7, they were like splitting hairs about stuff. And then there was the adoption of the Ever Virgin Mary and things like that. So the Anglican Communion would only adopt the first 4. Hardcore Baptists would be like, we reject everything. We're only Bible, okay? And so you see where this comes from, where I talk about this, is that when we become too biblicist, if you will, it can become almost Bibleolatry, right? Elevating the Bible above God. We owe a lot to these first 4 ecumenical councils. A lot of the things that we believe, that we hold to, Trinity, the hypostatic union of Jesus, all these kind of things, were hashed out in these councils. They're not explicitly listed in the scriptures. You can draw them out from the scriptures, and obviously the early church fathers did that, but they are not explicitly listed there. And so if you were to, like this guy, Arius, he proof texted his own theology out of the scriptures.
And it was still done today, like Jehovah's Witnesses.
Totally. Yep. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses believe in 3 distinct gods and a bunch of other things too. Apollonius, same deal. He proof texted his way into it. Now, Nestorian, I actually appreciate the book talked about Nestorius and how he was actually just sort of whipping boy. He didn't actually believe in what he got condemned for. There's a whole backstory of that in politics and all this kind of stuff. And he talked a little bit about with Cyril and his sort of just this ambition this guy had, and he just basically used Nestorian as a scapegoat to whatever, push his own agenda. But anyways, we owe a lot to these councils. We confess the Nicene Creed. All this stuff came out of that. And so I do think there is a place to honor and hold the fact that the Holy Spirit worked powerfully in these councils to help define and clarify some of these things. I mean, that video we watched at the beginning is funny, but it's true. These were the debates, like, oh, it's like water. It's modalism, like, it's true. Like, these are things that we couldn't quite figure out until these councils came together and said, okay, let's clarify and let's write them down in creeds. There are still faith traditions today that are what they call non-creedal. They say, well, we don't believe in creeds, which ironically is a creed. Because when you say I don't believe in creeds, that's our creed, then that's a creed. So whatever. But
so check the little cartoon
yes,
that was taking on St. Patrick, kind of attacking was St. Patrick somebody that was fuzzy on these things, or?
I don't think so. No, it's just
Okay.
This is Ireland.
It's just Ireland. So yeah.
Chuck, what do you think, where do you think today's church in America and throughout the world is not living up to our creed?
Oh,
falling from
great
those?
question. Yeah, did you guys all hear that?
How much time do you have?
I know, right? I know. How much time do you have? Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to keep hammering on this one because it is very consistent in our world today. And one is dualism, this idea that our body and our spirit are separate.
Explain that some more.
So so let's go back to Jewish faith, Hebrew, Old Testament, whatever else. It's very clear that the body and spirit are one. In fact, the word that we translate soul from the Old Testament, nephesh, in the Hebrew, actually means, it literally means throat. And it means kind of your whole being, because everything that goes in and out of you comes through your throat. And so the wholeness of you. So if you were to ask a Hebrew, they would say, you don't have a spirit, you are a spirit. Somehow we've gotten this out of Greek thought, this idea that there's like a ghost in the machine kind of thing. And then when the machine dies, then the ghost goes off into this other hyperspace, into another dimension or something like that. And that's what we think heaven is. And that's just not scripturally consistent. Scripturally, we know that creation is going to be renewed and reborn in some new way. It's not, we don't hop over to some other dimension. It's this, just recreated. And we resurrect physically, whatever that looks like. Doesn't mean if our bodies rot away and then there's nothing left because the worms ate it all. What does that look like? I don't know, but it's going to be cool, so that's one thing I think that's big. Oh, and then, oh man, this one's a pet peeve of mine. You guys know the song, I'll Fly Away? There's a verse in there. Okay, where is it? When the shadows of this life have gone, I'll fly away. Okay, here it goes. Like a bird from prison bars have flown. That's the spirit flying away from this prison. That's Gnostic. That's Gnosticism. That's saying that your flesh is bad and your spirit needs to escape and be free from this terrible prison. I don't like that song because it's Gnostic. So, there's another one. So I think those are some things. I think modalism is common. We see where God manifests himself in this way. Well, that couldn't be modalism. The other thing is that God is, he acts as the Father, and then he does a shapeshifter thing and then becomes the Holy Spirit, and then shapeshifts and then becomes the Son, as opposed to being one at the same time, all three. Like they coexist as three persons in one Godhead, and they had always existed from the beginning of time and always will exist. So the Son didn't cease to exist when Jesus ascended or died. Like Jesus always was, always will be. Makes sense? So, and then the other one is Monophysitism. We do get into this mentality of well, Jesus had it easier because he was God. So, he could just do things better because he was God. He had a leg up over us. And so, I'm tempted, but Jesus he didn't sin because he just had it easy because he was God. That's Monophysitism, and that's not really fair to say either. So some of these things, it says Jesus was tempted in every way. So he understands our struggles. So, yeah.
Chuck?
Yes, sir.
We learn in Revelations that there's going to be this, that heaven's going to come to
Yeah.
But where Paul see through heaven, and where are Abraham, Moses, and Isaiah that Jesus saw?
Yeah, good question. Let's see. I'm trying to think here how much time we have. So, I mean, these are really great questions. I'm just trying to.
I'm okay with
Yeah.
don't get it.
Well, I think we do get it. It's just hard to explain. And Revelation 2 is a whole other ball of wax that I don't want to talk about right now, because it's apocalyptic literature, which we're just simply not familiar with in our world today. In Second Temple Judaism, in other words, in the time of Jesus, they would have clearly understood apocalyptic literature. And today we're like, whoa, this is weird, because it is. So let's set Revelation aside for a second. I think where do these guys come from if they're dead, but they're also in the new creation? Is there this like limbo area until Christ comes? I mean, these are all hard things to explain because we also are physical creatures that exist in time. So like think of it this way, like so the question is, well, what happens when you die? Do you immediately go to heaven? Do you wait until Jesus comes back? Like here's my thought is, and this is what informed me the most is Back to the Future. is this idea that the space-time continuum exists only for us. So when you die, time ceases to exist, and God actually lives not outside of time, but he just sort of exists in and out of time all at once. And so when we die, it's like time ceases to exist, and so for that person, if you will, if you were to experience it, would just immediately then experience the new creation. Does that make sense? I mean, it's a trippy thing. It's one of those things. These are hard to explain things. So we could spend a whole day on just that. But these are good questions. So, anything else review-wise? Yes.
One thing that really struck me was the whole reason why Constantine had the first convention or whatever it was, because Christianity was the new religion of the empire, and the thing he saw most destructive was dissension, and he wanted everybody to be united. So the whole purpose of that was unification, and the more they had, the more offsprings they had. So, and I always thought in America, 300 denominations, probably more than that now. But we continue to do that. I mean, we continue trying to come down and be united, but then we splinter off like the last ones. Points.
Yeah. And this is one of the good debates about like Constantine, like what did he adopt Christianity because it had political advantages? Because he didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed. So like, because the bishops wouldn't even like allow it. Did he think of Christianity as a way to unify the empire? Was he really a faithful Christian? Like, these are all the great debates. I think at the very least, though, it was convenient now to start talking about some of these debates that occurred in theology, because now it's okay to be a Christian. So those weren't. There was probably a much greater diversity of faith than we would be comfortable with in our world today if we had transported ourselves back to the first, second, third century. I do think, but there was a great unity amongst the Christians too. Somebody called it once, I think, the early Christian internet. The fact that these letters got passed around quite rapidly, like within like decades, all around the Roman world. And so they were communicating and talking about things with one another and determining which writings were truly authentically apostolic, which ones weren't, and all that kind of stuff. So there was quite a bit of communication, quite a bit of unity, but there were little nuances that had to happen, and I think Constantine just took advantage of that, because now he was king, he was the man, so he could make it happen, and probably just took advantage of it. Yes. Good questions. So, anybody else? All right. Well, let's do it. Let's take this quiz. This one's actually a fun one. So go back to the back of your book. This one's easier. So chapter 4, learning, what do they call it? Learning activity. It's a fill in the blank one. Yep, chapter 4, it has the word search. You don't have to do the word search part. But just fill in the blank here with your table. and we'll come back together here in 5 minutes. So let's do this one quick today. So we'll go through these. The answers are in the word search, though, so if you don't remember how to spell somebody's name, it's in there.
I didn't find all these searching.
That's the hard part, yeah. You guys want to join up, or come on over?
Good morning, I think we met at Wayne.
So we're trying to put this down on page. No page.
No pay. I know. It's kind of annoying that there's no page number 2.
I don't remember that. There was a rich person, the rich lady.
So, man, oh, yeah.
I'm Dave.
Dave, Chuck. Yeah, I don't know if we met. Yeah. Cool.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Ambrose is preaching to rest. Somebody
Theodosius. Otherwise I wouldn't have gotten it.
Blake was misunderstood when he criticized the Comitatus for Mary and God. That was the one that got
Big sound, yeah.
Right, number 6. Blake convinced Attila the Hun to not plunder Rome. Number 7, I can remember that one because his name is something that makes sense to me. I mean, 45-41, the Council of Blake gives Ptolemy considerable right to nice creeds with the Blake can be the second council of Constantinople. Number 9, Blake and her twin brother Benedict built religious communities in Huh, that was Scholastic. Okay, even though she was English, Blake defended Celtic Irish traditions, and it's not a word. Hilda. Gregory is sometimes called the first. I thought the Pope didn't come around. I mean, they were popes, they were Leo's when they were.
Well, that's the big debate as soon as the first pope and whatever.
Yeah, well, I mean, there
Some
was.
people say Leo, some people say Gregory, some people say Peter.
All right, what person in this chapter would you like to meet?
Francis. You reject all the other ones.
What?
Wait, what was your second question then? I keep forgetting.
The mere Christianity metrics.
Yes.
Metrics of church vitality.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about what is true Christianity, and that's all about that.
Okay, good. All right, 30 seconds.
So everyone used to go to church with
He was sitting with him. But no, yeah, no.
okay.
So, what's your ethnic background? What is your ethnic background? What country are you from? Haiti. I've been to Haiti several times. Yeah. We started a school up in the mountains where they can literally find.
Alrighty. Let's bring it on back. Cool. Okay. Let's go through it. So, number 1. Yeah, Jovinian. Jovinian. Number 2. Before he became Milan's bishop, he was, or who is this? Ambrose, yeah, who was the guy who kind of basically converted Augustine. So there's an interesting lineage there to consider. But here's Ambrose, this guy who became the bishop of Milan before he was a Christian, and then became a Christian as bishop, which is funny, and then really adopted this Alexandrian view of allegorical interpretation of the scriptures, which became prominent throughout basically until the Protestant Reformation. And that came out of Augustine because he learned from Ambrose. So a very, very interesting thing to consider in history is how much we're informed by Augustine, who was informed by Ambrose. Very interesting. We'll talk about that in a second, because I'm going to talk about Eastern Orthodoxy for a second too, and we'll cover that. But fascinating guy. Fascinating guy. Okay, where are we at? Number 3. Olympius, yeah. Gave it all up. Yep, pretty impressive story, you know. Number 4. Ambrose is preaching and pressed. I just gave you the answer earlier. Yeah, Augustine, yeah. And then number 5, he was misunderstood. Nestorius, totally misunderstood. He wanted to, so the whole debate, this is what's interesting. I have it on the slides here. He didn't like the fact that Theotokos was the word they were using, because that just means God-bearer. Anthropotokos would mean, like human bearer, like man bearer. Chrysotokos would mean like, Messiah carrier. So he was like, can we come up with a word that sort of encapsulates all these things? And they were like, no, heretic, and they just kicked him out. And they ended up adopting Theotokos, and this has been still a big debate about, was maybe Nestorius was kind of right, because we do emphasize the God-bearer part and not the human bearer, which is funny. So anyways, he kind of probably got wrongly exiled, but a very interesting piece of history there. So, all right, number 6. Leo. This is fascinating. So here comes Attila the Hun, who, had just took over all of Asia. He just walks up, people just give up. And here comes Leo. Hey buddy, could you not sack Rome? Oh, sure man, no problem. Okay, have a good day. What on earth, what was that conversation? It's in history. It's all over the place that Leo kept Attila from raiding Rome. That's mind-boggling. So,
But I would like what it said in here, that Attila had probably already made up his mind to stop because of the condition of his troops. They were starving and hungry and all that. Before Leo ever came to that, just gave an excuse to do what he could be.
Yeah, but then, of course, historians would be like, well, they could have just camped and, ate some food, regained their strength, and then gone and whooped them anyways. Because that's what they had done that before. So, it's kind of mind-boggling to think about, like, what happened there. So, pretty impressive. So a lot of people think Leo was considered the first Roman, bishop of Rome that really had oomph behind it. And so a lot of people consider him the first pope. Okay, continue. Number 7, 8451, the Council of Chalcedon. Yep. Used Leo's tome, Cyril's writings, the Nicene Creed to explain the relationship of Jesus' 2 natures, and that's that whole video where St. Patrick tells everybody how it works. It's pretty funny. All right, number 8. Who convened the Second Council of Constantinople? Justinian, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. Pretty powerful guy. Look him up. Read a book about him someday. He's a fascinating figure in history. Number 9. Who and her twin brother Benedict built the first kind of monastic communities? Yeah, Scholastica. Okay. And then number 10, even though she was English, she was all about the Celts. Yeah, Hilda of Whitby. And then number 11, Gregory was sometimes confusingly also called the what? First pope, because some people consider Leo, some people consider Gregory. Some people consider Peter. I don't know. Depends on who you ask. Okay. And then, who's your favorite person? Who would you like to meet? Olympias? Yeah, she was pretty generous. Pretty amazing. What else?
Asked why she never remarried and how she decided to give all her money for free to slave.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting. Is that in the early church, marriage was considered almost like, well, you have a shortcoming or some sort of disability, so now you need to get married. Singleness was almost considered the standard. It's kind of interesting. We've now completely flipped that. And just a real quick missiological point of contention that I have is a fascinating book, this book by Wesley Hill. He wrote this book called Washed and Waiting. And it talks about this tension of what do you do if you have homosexual tendencies but want to maintain the Orthodox stance of, not, giving in and living a homosexual lifestyle, marrying, so on and so forth. So the stance is, okay, there are two stances. There's this hard-nosed stance of you just need to stop becoming gay. And then there's another stance which is, okay, you can have homosexual attraction, but it's the action upon it that is sin. And so if you stand in this camp, then the option is if you have no heterosexual attraction, then the only stance is to be celibate, to maintain orthodoxy. So anyway, so Wesley Hill goes through this and talks about this in this book. And at the very end, he brings up the Supreme Court case, and he says he finds it fascinating that this even came to the Supreme Court, this idea of marriage. He's like, why wouldn't a civil union be appropriate, or why wouldn't just the acknowledgement of gay marriages, but not from a state level, I guess, piece of paper, why wouldn't that be okay? And his idea that he posits is that we have so become obsessed in American culture that intimacy can only occur within the marital relationship, that if you don't get married, you're never going to experience intimacy. And so his whole debate is, he's like, this is a big problem. This is a big problem for just people generally. It's especially a big problem for homosexuals because even the word intimate has a connotation of sex. And so to learn how to be intimate with somebody outside of a marital sexual relationship is almost foreign in our American society. And it's become a problem. And he's like, and that's the reason why it even came to the court. He's like, nobody would have cared in another culture. I think that's fascinating. We have kind of elevated marriage. The whole even joke about ring for spring, like all that kind of stuff, like we have elevated marriage to this weird level where we think it's like you've arrived when you get married. And first century the early church would not have considered that. So anyways, that was a little bunny trail for you guys, but it's fascinating. So one other person, who's your favorite person? Who'd you like to meet out of this bunch of dudes? Anybody want to meet Attila?
Yeah.
Yeah? You want to meet Attila? Leo, okay, yeah. Okay. All right, cool. Well, let's move on here. I want to talk about a few things, then I want to open it up. Number one is, let's talk about the question that I posited last week, which is, what is the mere Christianity, the meat and potatoes that we need to hang on to? That was the thing I posited. But what I want to focus on, because we actually did talk about this in a whole class session when we actually read Mere Christianity. But more importantly, in light of that, I want us to talk about what is an appropriate metric to measure the strength of a church. Remember we talked about this last week, just very briefly at the end? How do we normally measure the strength of a church? Numbers. Is that appropriate always? Right? Okay, so then how do we measure a church and its strength and its awesomeness or not awesomeness?
Well, they say instead of quantity, it should be quality, right?
Okay.
But then the question becomes,
How do you measure quality? So tell me the answer.
Look at our living room before church on Sunday.
Very good.
Look at our living room before church on Sunday.
Yeah.
We've been to churches where you're not even greeted until you walk into the sanctuary to open the doors to go in. Some people aren't even talking to each other really, unless I know you. You know what I mean?
Totally.
But if you look at our living room in the morning before church, we got to turn the lights on and off.
Just to get people to
Just
sit
to
down.
get people
And they
to-
still don't sit down. And then they go in the sanctuary and they don't shut up. Yeah, yeah, it's
You know
good.
what? The alternative would be the other where nobody's talking to each other.
Totally. Yep.
So you could come up with a list, right? So what Paul's talking about, kind of the friendliness,
Mhm.
or you can talk about engagement,
Mhm.
volunteering, and there's probably 10 things you could sort of list to say, these are examples of things that you could say determine quality.
Mhm. I just want to real quick piggyback on Paul. So when my wife and I were looking for a church and then found the Bridge, that was one of our big things. Was when we went to a church, I would very strategically just sort of hang out in the narthex and wait to see who would greet me. And if nobody greeted me, that was definitely off the list. And that happened quite a bit.
It almost happened here, our first time.
Yeah?
And we walked in and I kind of stood back and it wasn't very few people. Eventually somebody came out, but we were thinking at that point, is this a place or not?
Oh, sure.
So
Yeah.
some people can be shadow, invisible. And,
Yeah.
And even though it seems like there's a lot of talking about.
And you know what? And I'll tell you just one thing, just as because this whole chapter is about servant leader or leader of servants, right? That cannot just happen amongst the staff of the church. Like, it is literally impossible for me to go and greet every single person. Although I do have I hold in my own head that I prioritize new people, faces that I don't recognize. So if I ever shrug you guys on Sunday, it's nothing personal. It's because I want to greet the new people first, because we can talk anytime, no hour, later this week, whatever. But there's new people really want some love. So yeah, go ahead.
Matthew 7, starting in verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father. So this is obedience, who is in heaven. Many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name drive out demons, in your name perform many miracles. Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.
So what's the metric in that?
Well, I think it's two metrics. One of them obedience, and the other one is that we need to know Jesus.
Know God. Yeah, totally. It's a song I don't hear very often anymore. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us till never fear. Or how does it go? And to all who will trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. This goes back to, and maybe we'll talk about this for a whole nother class, this almost allergy to works. We're not saved by works, so we shouldn't do anything. Because, but, I don't know. Jesus tells us, anyway, so keep that. So, yes,
Well, that's
obey.
part
Yeah.
of what I was thinking was more the impact you're having in the community around you.
Mhm.
Mission.
How much, and how much is it sticking beyond the walls of the church itself?
Mhm.
In my men's group, we've implemented that a little bit. It's okay, we've got church, we've got our, Tuesday nights. It's what happens in between times?
Mhm.
How much of this are we doing? And this last week, actually, we're do you have a devotional? Do you have time with God? What are you doing? And so it's all right, text people, what are you doing?
Yeah. And this goes back to the Christ and culture talk. We talk about how do you posture
Yeah.
Christ and culture, and there are some churches who are very introspective because they're afraid that the culture is going to screw them up, and we have to be very careful not to fall into that trap.
I think the coffee shop has helped bring people.
I think so.
Coffee.
We have. Even in our new members class, there was at least 4 people
There's a
like
lot
this
of
last
people
Sunday.
that may not come to church.
Hmm? Yeah. So at least four people came from the coffee shop.
I
or something.
greeted a new family that the son is a freshman at Bear Creek,
Right.
and they found us through the kids talking about the front porch and the basement.
Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah, they were there last week.
That's great.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
goes back to that servant leader.
Hmm. Totally. Butch.
Thinking of talking about the guy asking, what's the greatest commandment?
Mm-hmm.
And the second was love your neighbor as yourself. And I think we see a lot of that around here. Throughout the week, people reaching out to people who are hurting, who are celebrating, all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
I
Totally.
think that could be a measure.
Yeah, I think these are all good, appropriate measures. Cool. All right, well, let's talk about the book for just real quick, and then I want to hit a few things. So on page 52, we learn about John Chrysostom. This guy is one of my favorite figures in history because he really demanded holiness amongst God's people. Has anybody grown up or attended a Catholic church? Raise your hand. Or an Anglican church, Episcopal church, Eastern Orthodox church? Keep your hands up. Anybody? So the liturgy that is in those churches is based off of John Chrysostom's Divine Liturgy. It is that old. They're just slight tweaks, and obviously it's in English now, not Greek, but this guy wrote the liturgy that we actually, a lot of even what we even confess and do downstairs on Sunday morning, we're like liturgy light here, but a lot of that is even from John Chrysostom's statements and the Divine Liturgy that he wrote. So this guy's a pretty amazing figure. So if you want to learn more about him, have at it. But I think what's also interesting is John Chrysostom, along with Basil, are considered kind of the head figures that have really informed the Eastern Orthodox Church in a lot of their. They still do the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom on Sunday mornings. If you guys has anybody ever been to Eastern Orthodox Church? Anybody? Wow. Okay. Well, if you ever get a chance, I highly recommend it. It'll blow your mind. It's a very different world. But it's definitely a step back like 2,000 years. It's really a trip. But if you want to learn more about the Orthodox Church, read this book. It's the best one I know. A Basic Guide to Eastern Orthodox Theology by Eve Tibbs. She grew up, I believe, Baptist or something, whatever, evangelical Protestant. And then she converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't know if you guys know about this. She converted in the late 70s. She was there was this huge movement in the late 70s amongst Campus Crusade for Christ, where they were trying to figure out how can we get back to the original church? How can we get back to the most churchy churchness of church, right? They wanted to be the original. And after much discussion, they decided that the Eastern Orthodox formation of the church is the most appropriate and most healthy and most true to history. So a whole bunch of Campus Crusade for Christ guys went off and started their own, what they call autocephalous church in the Orthodox Church. And it became known as the Evangelical Orthodox Church in America. And there was this very kind man, I'm not going to go too much into the history, but he was a high-level, what they call metropolitan, which is like an archbishop in the Eastern Orthodox Church. He came and met with these guys and he goes, hey, we love you, this is great, but that's not quite how it works. You can't just go and start your own church. But we would like to kind of roll you in and help you. And so that movement became known as the Orthodox Church in America. And it was originally placed under the Russian Orthodox Church. And so you'll see I don't want to get into the church polity too much in Orthodox Church, but it's really fascinating. They have what they call autocephalous churches, which are self-governing churches. And they're under a patriarch. So the Patriarch of Constantinople is over the Greek Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of Antioch is over the Antiochian Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of Moscow is over the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on. And so, but these guys all have their own churches and church umbrellas, but they all sort of function and work together. This is why there is so much tension right now, so let's talk about current events, with Metropolitan Kirill in Russia. He's the Metropolitan in Moscow. He's the Patriarch of Moscow. And he has, if you guys have been watching the news, he has very much supported Putin and invading Ukraine and saying this is God and God, Putin is God's man. And the Orthodox Church doesn't quite know what to do with this because they don't have this Protestant background where they just cancel everybody and then move on and start a new break-off. They very much respect unity and desire unity, but they know that unity gets messy sometimes. how many of us are married realize that sometimes there are some ups and downs with the relationship, and it requires some. So that's why they can't just cancel anybody, because there's not a pope that's over all of them. They have to work together as a team to decide, okay, what do we do? What do we do here? And one of the things they did was the Patriarch of Constantinople went and appointed a new Patriarch of the Ukraine Orthodox Church during this whole time, which of course ticked off the Patriarch in Moscow. So, but these are all interesting dynamics that just do not occur. Well, first of all, they don't occur in Catholicism because they have a pope. So when there's one guy in charge, there you go, that's done. It just does not occur in Protestantism. We very much are more in the stance of, well, let me just break out and start my own church. They very much desire unity, and so they're willing to duke it out and fight it out for the sake of unity. That's something I think we can learn from the Orthodox Church that just simply does not exist. We're also very I think, divorced from the Orthodox Church because Protestant Reformation came out of Catholicism, which was the Western Church, and then we're sort of like, oh yeah, then those guys over there. And we don't really talk about them, we don't know much about them. And then we maybe think they're just some sort of exotic form of Catholicism, but that's actually not true. They have a very distinct theology, and it's robust and pretty powerful. I don't know how far I'm going to go into this because it's quite a long thing, but this is a really good book if you want to learn about the basics of Orthodoxy. So, yes, sir.
They have the same kind of situation with Mary the Catholics have. Was that there before?
Well, the idea of the Ever Virgin Mary was pre the split, pre the Great Schism. So that is still there. They don't have, so there's a whole study called Mariology, right, about the study of Mary. And Mary is much more elevated, much higher in the Catholic Church than it is in the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox still consider her the greatest of the saints. So she's kind of the top dog of the saints, whereas the Catholics have elevated her to this whole another level, like the Immaculate Conception and so on and so forth. So she's in a different level in the world. But they do consider her very high level, if you will, and they call her Theotokos. So, yeah.
So,
Yes,
so,
sir.
you're saying the U.S. version of this Orthodox Church has been in existence for 50 years, but the others in the other parts of the world have existed for
Forever.
whatever.
2000 some years, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a little complicated too, is that the Orthodox Church in America has taken more of an ethnic kind of flavor than it would have in other countries. And part of that's because of America. There's no state religion. And so when immigrants would come, they would just take their faith and also then take their administrative structure. So if you were Russian Orthodox, you would set up a Russian Orthodox church under the Patriarch of Russia, or Moscow. If you were Greek Orthodox, you would just come and set up a church in America and then be under the Patriarch of Constantinople. And so it became very ethnic, but that wasn't consistent in other countries, if that makes sense.
So the one that they started here 50 years ago, who was the patriarch of that?
Well, nobody, and that's why this one guy came in and was like, hey, you can't really do that. Yeah. His name was, I can't remember his name now. Fascinating figure. No, you're cool.
Too far down.
No, this is good. So what happened was they did have to, this guy came in and did teach them, you have to place yourself under a patriarch, and they decided to place themselves on the Moscow Patriarch. And so that's now become known as the Orthodox Church in America, which is under the Russian Patriarch. So the Autocephalous Church of Russia, if you will, if that makes sense. So yeah, there are different flavors. If you go around here, so there's St. John Chrysostom over here. That's a Antiochian, I think that one's Antiochian. There's the Assumption of the Theotokos over in Cherry Creek, the big cathedral. That's Greek.
In North Denver, there's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Over by Cornerstone Park, there's St. Herman. That's Orthodox Church in America, which is Russian. They're all over the place, and they all have different patriarch heads. Yeah, and what's interesting is if you go to the service, they're all very, very similar, super similar, because they're all practicing the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. So for a layman, if you go into the church, you wouldn't even notice a difference between them all. They look exactly the same. The liturgy is exactly the same. And most of them still do it. They do it in English now, so you can even pick up what's going on. It's pretty crazy. So, yes, sir.
Just curious if you have an idea. These particular churches that are under the Moscow regime, I guess we'll call it, does what they're doing in Russia with Ukraine, does that carry over that, yeah, we think Putin's right, or do they just ignore that?
You mean the other autocephalous churches? Or you mean the other Orthodox, or Russian Orthodox?
Under Moscow, whatever they call it.
Oh no, it's a real tension. A lot of even bishops in Russia are even like, I don't know about this guy. So no, it's a very tense situation. Most of the American Russian churches have been quite outspoken about that that's wrong, and you can't just, because they think even theologically that's wrong. So whether you agree with Putin or not, they're like theologically assigning God over somebody is a slippery slope, because that happened with a guy like named Hitler, Mussolini, like this other guy. So this is a problem. This is actually a problem when people do that even in America. Like, oh man, this president is God's man. I'm like, whoa there, bucko, you know. So theologically, that's a real prickly thing to enter into. And so the Orthodox churches has a problem with that, just even theologically. I mean, they also, of course, have a problem with it politically for most of them too. But yeah. So. But some of them do agree with Kirill, so it's a tricky thing. So yeah. Hang on, I'm gonna look this up because this is fascinating to me. What's that guy's name? It's gonna kill me now. It's gonna bug me all day now because I can't remember it. Anywho, oh yeah, Alexander Schmemann. It's a good name, Schmemann. Yeah, Alexander Schmemann is the guy who approached this breakoff from the Campus Crusade for Christ and said, "Whoa, guys, you gotta like do this the right way," and he assisted them in forming this. What that's now. Actually, what's crazy is if you go down to St. Herman's Church here, by the way, the priest there, Father John, he went to Dallas Theological Society, grew up Baptist, was part of Campus Crusade for Christ. Guess when he converted to Eastern Orthodoxy? During this exact same time.
So why did they have created
It's crazy.
a patriarch for America?
Yeah, good question. So that has been in the talks about maybe doing that someday, but they're not. There's once again, there's all this infighting amongst the fact that it's become so ethnic in America, and that it's not a very large number of people, and so that has been a thought is why don't we create an American patriarch? Because they created a Moscow patriarch.
But that was ancient.
It wasn't ancient. That was from Vladimir when he converted. So I mean, originally the patriarchs were just the major cities in the Roman Empire. So Alexandria, Rome, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome was considered. They would consider that particular patriarch or bishop or whatever of that city as the greater among equals, and that morphed into the Pope because these guys gained so much political power, and so that was the big thing. So up until they started, calling themselves the Pope, the Orthodox Church had no problem deferring to them as the greater among equals. In today's Orthodox Church, the greater among equals, what they call the it's going to kill me now. The Ecumenical Patriarch is Constantinople. So the Ecumenical Patriarch is considered sort of the greater among equals, is now the Constantinople one. So the fact that Kirill is kind of posturing like he's the boss, because he is the head of the biggest Orthodox autocephalous church, he thinks he's top dog, but the Patriarch of Constantinople historically has been the Ecumenical Patriarch ever since the Roman Church broke off. So yeah, this is ancient stuff. Super cool, interesting. But it's a whole piece of history we don't want to talk about. I'm a little disappointed too in Shelley because he had this very thin chapter about orthodoxy. Talk about it for 2 seconds. Most church history books don't even talk about orthodoxy. But it's an entire half of the church. And what's really interesting about the Orthodox Church is when the schism happened, they said, they sort of, I don't know, you want to say props or whatever, they were like, just wait, because you guys are schismatic, you're going to have other schisms. And they did. And then the Protestant Reformation happened, they're like, see, schism breeds schism. And then look at us now, breaking off, starting new churches all the time. They're not wrong. They're, the Orthodox stance and desire for unity is so strong that, like I said, they're willing to weather these differences, whereas we're not. We're just go start a new church. It's kind of mind-boggling. I don't know, I kind of went off a little bit there. So, any other questions about Orthodoxy? I mean, that's a whole other can of worms that we might not get to, but
How does the person in Moscow,
Kirill,
whatever his name is, how does he exercise authority over the church here in Denver?
well, he kind of doesn't, because, so once again, it's called an autocephalous church, which is just a fancy way of saying self-governing. So the only thing that he would do is appoint and ordain archbishops, or what they call metropolitans. And then those metropolitans would then ordain priests and deacons and so on down. So it's just, because remember we talked about church government structures? They exist in an episcopal polity where they have a hierarchical structure. So he doesn't dictate like what their beliefs should be on Putin and invading Ukraine. The only control he has is ordaining other bishops.
He could ordain some really bad people.
He could ordain some really bad bishops, and that's why they're keeping an eye on everything. That's part of why the Patriarch in Constantinople went and started a new Ukrainian autocephalous church so that they could ordain their own bishops, so that they wouldn't get Russian plants, if you will, if that makes sense. So, very interesting. It's very, very interesting. But they would not consider themselves a separate church. They are like, nope, we are one church. We just have a guy over here we have a problem with. And they have a deep theology that God will deal with it. And sometimes God uses people who are terrible to do things for his namesake. And sometimes things happen and they're just bad. It's just the world we live in. So. Then you get into the question of evil and all that stuff, but yeah.
It seems like the parable of the wheat and the tares is relevant because within Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy, there's probably a significant, maybe large population of people who aren't saved at all, and there's a remnant of those who are real believers. You know, you get something like Sturgeon said that he thought 50% of his congregation wasn't saved, or something like that, and so it's somehow what I've been trying to study is how do you measure what at a personal level is somebody really what that verse says? Do they actually know Jesus?
Is that our job?
Well, that's really hard to do.
Well,
and there are some churches who do. They'll try and be like, you're a Christian, you're not a
It seems like
Christian.
there ought to be metrics like daily Bible reading or things like that some level of Orthodox belief. Because that recently the theology report on American Christians came out, and it's pretty alarming about what people believe and what they don't believe that are considered evangelicals.
And this is the same debate they had in the early church, which is why this was going on. If you want to go really far back, because you guys know about, like, there were other gospels that were written that didn't make it into the canon. Yeah, like the Gospel of Thomas is the most famous one because of Da Vinci Code and all that stuff. But there were other gospels, and a lot of the ways that they determined whether these gospels were authoritative and from an apostolic source wasn't from the writing, but was from the community and the fruits of the community that it served or whatever. So to some degree you can measure that, but it becomes really tricky sometimes, especially on an individual level. But that's also a highly American way of viewing things, is that, and this is actually another thing I think we can learn from the Orthodox Church, is they emphasize, like the Orthodox Church thinks we're crazy that all of our worship songs are all first person singular now, right? Me, God save me, Jesus me, right? But it really should be like in the plural, second person plural. Like, and ended by God. But I mean, when it refers to what God does for us, it should be in the second person plural. That it should be like, and they emphasize this, sure, like Jesus came to save the church, not to save, Dwayne. I mean, he did, but it does the wholeness. You know what I mean? And so I think even that, to consider that there's a collective quality to that is really interesting, but it's so foreign to our American mentality that it's hard. It's even hard for me to wrap my brain around it. It's very, very difficult. So. But it is tricky to consider that. That's why I think we talk a lot about Christian formation, what can help you be more formed into Christ. This is why at the beginning of the year we talked about the rule of life. This is Benedict. You guys read about Benedict. Like, he created the rules. Not rules, but rule, as in a way of living to allow space for the Holy Spirit to work through you and make you more into Christ. A lot of times, young Christians won't look very Christian-like. And sometimes old Christians won't look very Christian-like because it depends on how much are we quenching the Holy Spirit, Scripture talks about, or are we allowing God to work in us and change us from within? It's a huge debate. So,
Well, one thing else on this time period, like when they were being persecuted and killed and all that kind of stuff, if you were a Christian, you had a deep faith. And then when it became okay, it increased in numbers, but did all those new Christians have that same deep faith? I think that was a real drive back then. That's when the growth, the numbers didn't necessarily align with the thing.
Totally.
Being Christian because that was the thing to do versus deep commitment.
Yep. Which, two things there. That is what led to the Desert Fathers escaping and running off to the desert because they're like, well, everybody's just becoming Christians because it's politically convenient. I'm going to go do the real deal now. I'm going to be a real deal Christian. So they went and lived on these pillars and ate dirt. I don't know what they. So they wanted to be more ascetic, more with God than others, and so there was that debate. The other thing is, did this book talk about who's that guy, the warlord? Nope, the guy who became Christian, then his whole army got baptized. No, oh man, I'm tripping now. Clovis. Have we read about Clovis yet? Okay, I bet we will. It'll at least talks about in the Bruce Shelley book. I haven't read it far enough ahead on this one yet. Clovis was a king who was converted to Christianity, and his whole army was like, "Cool, let's be Christians," and they all got baptized. What does that mean? Did they all come to an individual faith? That's an American mentality. To them, they were like, well, my king's a Christian, and so I too will now become a Christian because they were loyal to this king. They saw the faith as more of an allegiance than some sort of individual regenerative moment. So once again, these are questions that are very much informed by the historical particularity of how things were considered, how they thought back
Even
then.
in the first century, when people were being converted, there were times when the head of a household would make that decision and the whole household would follow suit.
Totally.
Because they thought it's one group, they were one group. So when one person or the head person did it, everybody did it.
Yep.
And they didn't question it. So I think we don't have that mentality now. We go off by ourselves.
Whenever we read about history, always think group before you think individual. Because in the vast majority of history, group has always been the way of thinking. And only in very, very recent times has individual been the way of thinking.
That was
So.
very hard as a missionary because they were group thinking. To really convert somebody, their intention and their alignment in thought, but because their family didn't agree, they wouldn't be baptized.
Yeah, totally.
Islam too.
Cool. So, if you guys are wondering, sometimes we talk about some of these high-level things. I don't expect you to understand everything we're necessarily talking about today, and that's okay. What this does is it stimulates our thinking, helps us to think about what we need to learn more, what can I go back and read some more on, study more. These are difficult things to wrap our brains around. It's difficult for me to wrap my brain around. Just to clarify, a couple things that kind of be confusing is when we talked about church polity, I just want to clarify. We talked about the three classic church polities: Episcopal, Presbyterian, and Congregational. Episcopal does not mean Episcopal as in the Episcopal Church. And Presbyterian does not mean Presbyterian as in the Presbyterian Church or the presbytery or all that kind of stuff, session and all that kind of Presbyterian setup. So don't get them confused when you go and learn about church polity. It is confusing that we overlap terms, but I know that was confusing for several people. That Presbyterian does not mean Presbyterian church denominational structure. It means elder-led, is what it literally means. So, and then Episcopal doesn't mean Episcopalian, Anglican. It means top-down hierarchical. And congregational means that everybody votes. And just so you know, here at Bridge, we run the gamut of all of them. In some ways, the decisions are made on an Episcopal basis because it's just simpler that way, right?
The way we were presented in our new members class in the merger was not that we were going from a Presbyterian kind of government, which meant outside accountability, to a congregational, and the actual bylaws, the Constitution that we're under now, is a congregational.
It is, and I'm going to get there. So on some basis, we make Episcopal decisions, like if we hire a new person for the coffee shop, right? We don't take a congregational vote on that. It would just be a waste of time, right? So, and then over here congregationally, if we adopt new bylaws or if we vote for a new elder, things like that, that's done as congregationally. But at the same time, there's lots of stuff that occurs kind of in the background where elders help inform the pastors and the other church staff on how to make best decisions. And also to sort of bridge all of this, like if, God forbid, something, sin happened, whatever, with some of the pastoral staff or whatever, and we need to can somebody because they're in sin, that probably wouldn't just somehow magically float up from the congregational side. It would probably come from the elders now presenting it to the congregation and saying, we need to get rid of Chuck or whatever because he's in sin. And then that would be a congregational vote to then decide. So technically, there is a congregational element to it where we all do make congregational decisions. But in a pure congregationalist, it's like we're all going to make a vote on what color the carpet's going to be. We're going to make a vote on what kind of camera we're going to buy for the streaming. And there are churches that do operate like that. And so you'll see, I don't know if this helps, but very, very, very congregational polities tend to be like Anabaptist. It's like Mennonite, Amish, that kind of stuff. Very, very Episcopal is like Catholics. That's about as Episcopal as it gets. Lutheran is somewhere over here, but not all the way Presbyterian because they don't have like a pope per se. So once again, it's a spectrum. And there's a lot of ways you can kind of ride all the spectrum to get the best of both worlds, or best of all three worlds. And I think that's a lot of what we try to do here at Bridge is to try and cover all
The
this.
other confusion is, the way you're presenting it, is there's a big difference between governmental accountability, which you have Episcopal and Presbyterian, and personal accountability. And that makes a huge difference. That was a big part of the Mars Hill podcast with Tim Keller was called to account. Why didn't you hold Mark Driscoll accountable under the Gospel Coalition? You made the point, well, a network doesn't have any authority.
Yep. So we're running out of time here. We could talk about this a lot because it's true. The accountability aspect of church structure is important. There is no simple solution or perfect way. Even in the Presbyterian denomination, or any denomination, denominations tend to protect their own, which is a problem. When you have an Episcopal structure, sometimes there isn't much accountability. There is a huge swath of problems on all accounts and all fronts. The best thing we can get for accountability is just pray to God that God will expose when there's sin and things need to change. And that will occur through whatever channels we've set up. God's church has continued on for 2,000 years, and in various church polities, and some have come and some have gone. But God's kingdom keeps rolling. So that's a whole. We could talk about that a whole nother day too, just about how do you set up good church accountability networks, which is a challenge. It is hard to figure out how do you do that well, how do you do that perfectly. Well, there's no perfect way, for sure. But so, anyways, hopefully that clarifies some things. We are about to go into the medieval era, So I highly recommend this little tiny book. It's called Faith in the Medieval World by G.R. Evans. This will help you to gain a mentality of medieval thought, like cultural thought, as we go into the medieval era, so you can understand where did that come from and how did they think that way? Well, this helps explain that. Because once again, we're looking from the outside in into a culture and a time that was radically different than ours. And it helps inform you. So you might find out that the Dark Ages weren't so dark. So
how far is our reading in Shelley?
Yes, good question. All right, so here's our homework for next week. Next week, Carl's going to be teaching, so I will be out of town. So chapter 5 in the little book, and then if you're reading Shelley's book, chapter 17 through 20 as well. And then, like I said, I highly recommend this book. You don't have to go and read this by next week or whatever, but if you want to read this over the next few weeks as we go into the medieval era, because Scott Wenning is going to come and talk about the High Middle Ages, which then leads into the Protestant Reformation. And if you don't get medieval thought, you won't get Luther. And if you don't get Luther, then you're definitely not going to get our own Protestant bent on things and the bias that we have. So, any last minute thoughts, comments, attitudes, quiet reservations?
Where does one get that book?
Amazon, baby. Yeah.
Prime.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Or you can support your local independent bookstore.
That's correct. Although I doubt Town or Cover carries this, but they might. They might. Oh, that's true. They can order. Or my personal independent, my favorite personal independent bookstore, which often has free shipping, is Powell's from Portland. So just saying.